We spent time last week talking about the attitudes different African peoples take toward the trees and forests of the continent. As part of this, we touched very lightly on how these attitudes differ between the rainforest hunter gatherers or forest people of Central Africa and people from other parts of the continent. Forest people are also called pygmies, although that term is sometimes considered derogatory. The term pygmy, however, alludes to the generally short stature of these people. The average adult man grows to be no more than 5 feet or 1.5 meters tall. But don't let the short stature fool you. As their name suggests, African forest people are skilled hunters and gatherers and possess an almost encyclopedic knowledge of their forest home. Forest people are also known worldwide for their musical skill. Matter of fact, we spent time last year talking about liquindi or water drumming and polyphonic singing, two things they are very well known for. You'll probably not find much about African forest people in regular African history books, except maybe as players in some bigger political event. And this speaks to just how much the people and their lives have been neglected. However, folklore is replete with stories of encounters between them and wider African populations. And as we talked about last week, because they often involve harmful stereotypes, these encounters had and continue to have largely negative impact on forest people. In today's episode, we will read one of those folktales. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Nde. The Forest Being and His Palm Nut, as told by the Baluba and Lulua of the Republic of Congo. One day, a village chief went hunting further from home than usual. He eventually came upon a lake teeming with fish and other animals. He decided to move his people close to it since no other peoples lived in the areas. The chief and his men quickly cleared land near the lake and built huts to create a village. The men began hunting and the women began planting on the land. The children were especially excited to live near such a big lake. They spent the hottest part of every day swimming and playing in the cool water. Soon the area was filled with the sounds of activity in the new village. But the people didn't know that a clan of forest beings lived in the woods near the lake. The hunting, farming, and noise from all the activity drove away many of the animals and fish, leaving nothing for the forest beings to live on. This angered them greatly. One forest being in particular was deeply resentful of this intrusion. For several days, he watched the children playing. He saw how plump and juicy they were and wondered if they tasted as good as they looked. He also noticed that the children liked to sing and dance. So the forest being found a large hollow log big enough for an animal to fit inside. Next, he caught a large snake and skinned it and stretched the skin over an open end of the hollow log to make a drum. Then he went to the lake and began beating his drum. At first, the children were cautious, ready to run from the strange drummer. But the beat was so good, their shoulders and hips began to sway. Soon, they were gathered around the forest being and his drum, dancing happily. However, the oldest boy in the group was suspicious of this strange creature. He hung back from the others, watching them dance. And dance they did. The children danced and danced until they were exhausted and fell to the ground, panting for breath. The forest being stopped playing and offered a palm nut to the nearest girl, who was so hungry from dancing that she popped it into her mouth without thinking. In a few moments, she fell asleep, sprawled on the forest being's lap. When the boy saw how fast the little girl fell asleep, he jumped up and ran towards the village, calling for the children to follow him. Back in the village, the boy told the chief and his men about the strange drummer and the little girl. The chief's men grabbed their weapons and headed for the lake. But on their way, they found the forest being walking through the forest with its drum, which it carried on its head. The little girl was nowhere in sight. Surrounding it, they demanded to know where she was. I left her sleeping by the lake, the forest being replied, and tried to walk away. But the chief was suspicious. Take us to where you left her, he insisted. They forced the forest being to take them back to the shore where the children had been dancing. And as suspected, the little girl was not there. The chief turned to the forest being, who was panting slightly from the effort of carrying the drum. The girl's not here, the chief said, but your drum seems very heavy. What could be in it to make it so heavy? Oh, only stones, the forest being replied. Who put stones in a drum? The chief wondered out loud, lifting his knife. Alarmed, the forest being dropped the drum and jumped back, thinking the chief wanted to stab him. With one swift motion, the chief slit open the drum skin. Inside, sound asleep, was the little girl. The forest being took advantage of the distraction and ran off into the forest. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story and that it gave you something to think about. And there is a lot to think about in this story. There are layers of meaning which we could dig into: the skin of the snake that was used to cover the drum, the relationships between the forest being and the people who settled in their land, as we talked about, the way the older boy hung back and observed and watched and saw that something was wrong with the scenario, the chief and his men going into the forest and tracking down the forest being. If you know anything about African folklore, each of these aspects could probably be peeled back and would mean something deeper than what they present themselves to mean in the story. But at the same time, it's a great way in which these relationships are portrayed and explored. We see some of the negative portrayals, especially with the forest beings being characterized as cannibals. Something that forest people would do is sharpen their teeth. Some forest people would sharpen their teeth to make it easier for them to eat meat. And you can imagine if you were not one of the forest people and you ran into one of them, they look different from you. They almost blend into the forest and they have sharp teeth and they are not exactly happy to see you around. It's kind of easy to see how some people would think of them as anything other than just different physically presenting human beings. But that is a story for another day. We'll be back next week, which is also next month, with more stories and commentary from African folklore. And as you may remember, MA's focus for this year will be on the connection between folklore and mythology and geography and history and psychology. So there is much to come, and I hope you stick around for it. We are also 2 weeks away from Pop Day for the MA book, the Watkins Book of African Folklore, and I am absolutely not freaking out. Who? Me? Nope. Not a single sleepless night or anxiety-induced binging on popcorn over here. None of that. But hey, I received a box of my author copies this week, so it's real. The countdown is on, and keep an eye out for the unboxing video. As always, I'll include a link to pre-order the book and also to RSVP for upcoming book talks online, as well as in Atlanta and Dallas. Thank you as always for listening, and I will see you next week.